Chapter XVIII of A Lady of Quality by Frances Hodgson Burnett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter XVIII. My Lady Dunstanwolde sits late alone and writes. That she must leave the panelled parlour at her usual hour, or attract attention by doing that to which her household was unaccustomed, she well knew, her manner of life being ever stately and ceremonious in its regularity. When she dined at home, she and Anne partook of their repast together in the large dining room, the table loaded with silver dishes and massive glittering glass, their powdered, gold-laced lacqueys in attendance, as though a score of guests had shared the meal with them. Since her lord's death there had been nights when her ladyship had sat late, writing letters and reading documents pertaining to her estates, the management of which, though in a measure controlled by stewards and attorneys, was not left to them, as the business of most great ladies is generally left to others. All papers were examined by her, all leases and agreements clearly understood before she signed them, and if there were aught unsatisfactory, both stewards and lawyers were called to her presence to explain. "Never did I, or any other man, meet with such a head upon a woman's shoulders," her attorney said, and the head steward of Dunstanwolde and Helversley learned to quake at the sight of her bold handwriting upon the outside of a letter. "Such a lady," he said, "such a lady! Lie to her if you can, palter if you know how. Try upon her the smallest honest shrewd trick, and see how it fares with you. Were it not that she is generous as she is piercing of eye, no man could serve her and make an honest living." She went to her chamber and was attired again sumptuously for dinner. Before she descended she dismissed her woman for a space on some errand, and when she was alone, drawing near to her mirror, gazed steadfastly within it at her face. When she had read Osmond's letter her cheeks had glowed, but when she had come back to earth, and as she had sat under her woman's hands at her toilet, bit by bit the crimson had died out as she had thought of what was behind her and of what lay before. The thing was so stiffly rigid by this time, and its eyes still stared so. Never had she needed to put red upon her cheeks before, nature having stained them with such richness of hue. But as no lady of the day was unprovided with her crimson, there was a little pot among her toilet ornaments which contained all that any emergency might require. She opened the small receptacle and took from it the red she for the first time was in want of. "I must not wear a pale face, God knows," she said, and rubbed the colour on her cheeks with boldness. It would have seemed that she wore her finest crimson when she went forth, fully dressed from her apartment. Little Nero grinned to see her, the lacqueys saying amongst themselves that his Grace's courier had surely brought good news, and that they might expect his master soon. At the dinner table 'twas Anne who was pale and ate but little, she having put no red upon her cheeks, and having no appetite for what was spread before her. She looked strangely as though she were withered and shrunken, and her face seemed even wrinkled. My lady had small leaning towards food, but she sent no food away untouched, forcing herself to eat, and letting not the talk flag, though it was indeed true that 'twas herself who talked. Mistress Anne speaking rarely, but as it was always her way to be silent, and a listener rather than the one who conversed, this was not greatly noticeable. Her ladyship of Dunstanwolde talked of her guests of the afternoon, and was charming and witty in her speech of them. She repeated the mots of the wits, and told some brilliant stories of certain modish ladies and gentlemen of fashion. She had things to say of statesmen and politics, and was sparkling indeed in speaking of the lovely languisher whose little wrist was too delicate and slender to support the loaded whip. While she talked, Mistress Anne's soft, dull eyes were fixed upon her with a sort of wonder which had some of the quality of bewilderment. But this was no new thing either, for to the one woman the other was ever something to marvel at. "It is because you are so quiet a mouse, Anne," my lady said, with her dazzling smile, "that you seem never in the way. And yet I should miss you if I knew you were not within the house. When the Duke takes me to Camylott, you must be with me even then. It is so great a house that in it I can find you a bower in which you can be happy even if you see us but little. 'Tis a heavenly place, I am told, and of great splendour and beauty. The park and flower gardens are the envy of all England." "You will be very happy, sister," said Anne, "and like a queen." "Yes," was her sister's answer, "yes," and 'twas spoken with deep indrawn breath. After the repast was ended she went back to the Painted Parlour. "You may sit with me till bedtime if you desire, Anne," she said, "but 'twill be but dull for you, as I go to sit at work. I have some documents of import to examine and much writing to do. I shall sit up late." And upon this she turned to the lacquey holding open the door for her passing through. "If before 10:30 there comes a message from Sir John Oxon," she gave order, "it must be brought to me at once, but later I must not be disturbed. It will keep until morning." Yet as she spoke there was before her as distinct a picture as ever of what lay waiting and gazing in the room to which she went. Until 12 o'clock she sat at her table, a despatch box by her side, papers outspread before her. Within 3 feet of her was the divan, but she gave no glance to it, sitting, writing, reading, and comparing documents. At 12 o'clock she rose and rang the bell. "I shall be later than I thought," she said. "I need none of you who are below stairs. Go all you to bed. Tell my woman that she also may lie down. I will ring when I come to my chamber and have need of her. There is yet no message from Sir John?" "None, my lady," the man answered. He went away with a relieved countenance as she made no comment. He knew that his fellows, as well as himself, would be pleased enough to be released from duty for the night. They were a pampered lot and had no fancy for late hours when there was no great entertainments being held, which pleased them and gave them chances to receive vails. Mistress Anne sat in a large chair, huddled into a small heap and looking colourless and shrunken. As she heard bolts being shot and bars put up for the closing of the house, she knew that her own dismissal was at hand. Doors were shut below stairs, and when all was done the silence of night reigned, as it does in all households when those who work have gone to rest. 'Twas a common thing enough, and yet this night there was one woman who felt the stillness so deep that it made her breathing seem a sound too loud. "Go to bed, Anne," she said. "You have stayed up too long." Anne arose from her chair and drew near her. "Sister," she said, as she had said before, "let me stay." She was a poor weak creature, and so she looked with her pale insignificant face and dull eyes, a wisp of loose hair lying damp on her forehead. She seemed indeed too weak a thing to stand even for a moment in the way of what must be done this night, and 'twas almost irritating to be stopped by her. "Nay," said my Lady Dunstanwolde, her beautiful brow knitting as she looked at her. "Go to your chamber, Anne, and go to sleep. I must do my work and finish to night what I have begun." But," Anne stammered, dominated again and made afraid, as she ever was, by this strong nature. "In the work you must finish. Is there not something I could do to aid you, even in some small and poor way? Is there not?" "Naught," answered Clorinda, her form drawn to its great full height, her lustrous eyes darkening. "What should there be that you could understand?" "Not some small thing? Not some poor thing?" Anne said, her fingers nervously twisting each other, so borne down was she by her awful timorousness, for awful it was indeed when she saw clouds gather on her sister's brow. "I have so loved you, sister, I have so loved you, that my mind is quickened somehow at times, and I can understand more than would be thought, when I hope to serve you. Once you said she knew not then, nor ever afterwards, how it came to pass that in that moment she found herself swept into her sister's white arms and strained against her breast, wherein she felt the wild heart bounding, nor could she, not being given to subtle reasoning, have comprehended the almost fierce kiss on her cheek, nor the hot drops that wet it. "I said I believed that if you saw me commit murder," Clorinda cried, "you would love me still, and be my friend and comforter." "I would, I would," cried Anne. "And I believe your word, poor faithful soul, I do believe it," my lady said, and kissing her hard again, but the next instant set her free and laughed. "But you will not be put to the test," she said, "for I have done none, and in 2 days' time my Gerald will be here, and I shall be safe, saved and happy for evermore, for evermore. There, leave me. I would be alone and end my work." And she went back to her table and sat beside it, taking her pen to write, and Anne knew that she dare say no more, and turning, went slowly from the room, seeing for her last sight as she passed through the doorway the erect and splendid figure at its task, the light from the candelabras shining upon the rubies round the snow white neck and wreathed about the tower of raven hair like lines of crimson. Chapter XIX of A Lady of Quality by Frances Hodgson Burnett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter XIX. A piteous story is told, and the old cellars walled in. It is, indeed, strangely easy in the great world for a man to lose his importance, and from having been the target for all eyes and the subject of all conversation, to step from his place, or find it so taken by some rival that it would seem, judging from the general obliviousness to him, that he had never existed. But few years before no fashionable gathering would have been felt complete had it not been graced by the presence of the young and fascinating Lovelace, Sir John Oxon. Women favoured him, and men made themselves his boon companions. His wit was repeated, the fashion of his hair and the cut of his waistcoat copied. He was at first rich and gay enough to be courted and made a favourite. But when his fortune was squandered and his marriage with the heiress came to naught, those qualities which were vicious and base in him were more easy to be seen. Besides, there came new male beauties and new dandies with greater resources and more of prudence, and these, beginning to set fashion, win ladies' hearts, and make conquests, so drew the attention of the public mind that he was less noticeable, being only one of many, instead of ruling singly as it had seemed that by some strange chance he did at first. There were indeed so many stories told of his light ways that, their novelty being worn off and new ones still repeated, such persons as concerned themselves with matters of reputation either through conscience or policy, began to speak of him with less of warmth or leniency. "'Tis not well for a matron with daughters to marry, and with sons to keep an eye to," it was said, "to have in her household too often a young gentleman who has squandered his fortune in dice and drink and wild living, and who 'twas known was cast off by a reputable young lady of fortune." So there were fine ladies who began to avoid him, and those in power at Court and in the world who regarded him with lessening favour day by day. In truth, he had such debts, and his creditors pressed him so ceaselessly, that even had the world's favour continued, his life must have changed its aspect greatly. His lodgings were no longer the most luxurious in the fashionable part of the town. His brocades and laces were no longer of the richest, nor his habit of the very latest and most modish cut. He had no more an equipage attracting every eye as he drove forth, nor a gentleman's gentleman whose swagger and pomp outdid that of all others in his world. Soon after the breaking of his marriage with the heiress, his mother had died, and his relatives being few, and those of an order strictly adverse to the habits of ill-provided and extravagant kinsmen, he had but few family ties. Other ties he had, 'twas true, but they were not such as were accounted legal or worthy of attention either by himself or those related to him. So it befell that when my Lady Dunstanwolde's lacquey could not find him at his lodgings, and as the days went past neither his landlady nor his creditors beheld him again, his absence from the scene was not considered unaccountable by them, nor did it attract the notice it would have done in times gone by. "He hath made his way out of England to escape us," said the angry tailors and mercers, who had besieged his door in vain for months, and who were now infuriated at the thought of their own easiness and the impudent gay airs which had befooled them. "A good 400 pounds of mine hath he carried with him," said one, "and 200 of mine, and more of mine, since I am a poor man to whom a pound means 20 guineas. We are all robbed, and he has cheated the debtors' prison, wherein, if we had not been fools, he would have been clapped 6 months ago." "Think ye he will not come back, gentlemen?" quavered his landlady. "God knows when I have seen a guinea of his money. But he was such a handsome, fine young nobleman, and had such a way with a poor body, and ever a smile and a chuck of the chin for my Jenny." "Look well after poor Jenny if he hath left her behind," said the tailor. He did not come back, indeed, and hearing the rumour that he had fled his creditors, the world of fashion received the news with small disturbance, all modish persons being at that time much engaged in discussion of the approaching nuptials of her ladyship of Dunstanwolde and the Duke of Osmonde. Close upon the discussions of the preparations came the nuptials themselves, and then all the town was agog, and had small leisure to think of other things. For those who were bidden to the ceremonials and attendant entertainments, there were rich habits and splendid robes to be prepared, and to those who had not been bidden, there were bitter disappointments and thwarted wishes to think of. "Sir John Oxon has fled England to escape seeing and hearing it all," was said. "He has fled to escape something more painful than the spleen," others answered. He had reached his rope's end, and finding that my Lady Dunstanwolde was not of a mind to lengthen it with her fortune, having taken a better man, and that his creditors would have no more patience, he showed them a light pair of heels. Before my Lady Dunstanwolde left her house, she gave orders that it be set in order for closing for some time, having it on her mind that she should not soon return. It was, however, to be left in such condition that at any moment, should she wish to come to it, all could be made ready in 2 days' time. To this end various repairs and changes she had planned were to be carried out as soon as she went away from it. Among other things was the closing with brickwork of the entrance to the passage leading to the unused cellars. "'Twill make the servants' part more wholesome and less damp and draughty," she said, "and if I should sell the place, will be to its advantage. 'Twas a builder with little wit who planned such passages and black holes. In spite of all the lime spread there, they ever were mouldy and of evil odour." It was her command that there should be no time lost, and men were set at work carrying bricks and mortar. It so chanced that one of them, going in through a back entrance with a hod over his shoulder, and being young and lively, found his eye caught by the countenance of a pretty, frightened looking girl, who seemed to be loitering about watching, as if curious or anxious. Seeing her near each time he passed, and observing that she wished to speak, but was too timid, he addressed her. "Would you know aught, mistress?" he said. She drew nearer gratefully, and then he saw her eyes were red, as if with weeping. "Think you her ladyship would let a poor girl speak a word with her?" she said. "Think you I dare ask so much of a servant? Or would they flout me and turn me from the door? Have you seen her? Does she look like a hard, shrewish lady?" "That she does not, though all stand in awe of her," he answered, pleased to talk with so pretty a creature. "I but caught a glimpse of her when she gave orders concerning the closing with brick of a passageway below. She is a tall lady, and grand and stately, but she hath a soft pair of eyes as ever man would wish to look into, be he duke or ditcher." The tears began to run down the girl's cheeks. "Ay," she said, "all men love her, they say. Many a poor girl's sweetheart has been false through her, and I thought she was cruel and ill natured. Know you the servants that wait on her? Would you dare to ask one for me if he thinks she would deign to see a poor girl who would crave the favour to be allowed to speak to her of a gentleman she knows?" "They are but lacqueys, and I would dare to ask what was in my mind," he answered. "But she is near her wedding day, and little as I know of brides' ways, I am of the mind that she will not like to be troubled." "That I stand in fear of," she said. "But oh, I pray you, ask some one of them, a kindly one." The young man looked aside. "Luck is with you," he said. "Here comes one now to air himself in the sun, having naught else to do. Here is a young woman who would speak with her ladyship," he said to the strapping, powdered fellow. "She had best be gone," the lacquey answered, striding towards the applicant. "Think you my lady has time to receive trapesing wenches?" "'Twas only for a moment I asked," the girl said. I would speak to her of Sir John Oxon, whom she knows." The man's face changed. It was Jenfry. "Sir John Oxon," he said. "Then I will ask her. Had you said any other name I would not have gone near her to day." Her ladyship was in her new closet with Mistress Anne, and there the lacquey came to her to deliver his errand. "A country bred young woman, your ladyship," he said, "comes from Sir John Oxon." "From Sir John Oxon!" cried Anne, starting in her chair. My Lady Dunstanwolde made no start, but turned a steady countenance towards the door, looking into the lacquey's face. "Then he hath returned?" she said. "Returned!" said Anne. "After the morning he rode home with me," my lady answered. "'Twas said he went away. He left his lodgings without warning. It seems he hath come back. What does the woman want?" she ended. "To speak with your ladyship," replied the man. "Of Sir John himself, she says." "Bring her to me," her ladyship commanded. The girl was brought in, overawed and trembling. She was a country bred young creature, as the lacquey had said, being of the simple rose and white freshness of 17 years perhaps, and having childish blue eyes and fair curling locks. She was so frightened by the grandeur of her surroundings, and the splendid beauty of the lady who was so soon to be a duchess, and was already a great earl's widow, that she could only stand within the doorway, curtseying and trembling, with tears welling in her eyes. "Be not afraid," said my Lady Dunstanwolde. "Come hither, child, and tell me what you want." Indeed, she did not look a hard or shrewish lady. She spoke as gently as woman could, and a mildness so unexpected produced in the young creature such a revulsion of feeling that she made a few steps forward, and fell upon her knees, weeping and with uplifted hands. "My lady," she said, "I know not how I dared to come, but that I am so desperate, and your ladyship being so happy, it seemed that you might pity me, who am so helpless and know not what to do." Her ladyship leaned forward in her chair, her elbow on her knee, her chin held in her hand, to gaze at her. "You come from Sir John Oxon?" she said. Anne, watching, clutched each arm of her chair. "Not from him, asking your ladyship's pardon," said the child, "but from the country to him," her head falling on her breast, "and I know not where he is." "You came to him," asked my lady. "Are you," and her speech was pitiful and slow, "are you one of those whom he has ruined?" The little suppliant looked up with widening orbs. "How could that be, and he so virtuous and pious a gentleman?" she faltered. Then did my lady rise with a sudden movement. "Was he so?" says she. "Had he not been," the child answered, "my mother would have been afraid to trust him. I am but a poor country widow's daughter, but was well brought up and honestly, and when he came to our village my mother was afraid, because he was a gentleman, but when she saw his piety and how he went to church and sang the psalms and prayed for grace, she let me listen to him." "Did he go to church and sing and pray at first?" my lady asks. "'Twas in church he saw me, your ladyship," she was answered. "He said 'twas his custom to go always when he came to a new place, and that often there he found the most heavenly faces, for 'twas piety and innocence that made a face like to an angel's, and 'twas innocence and virtue stirred his heart to love, and not mere beauty which so fades." "Go on, innocent thing," my lady said, and as she turned aside to Anne, flashing from her eyes unseen a great blaze, and speaking in a low and hurried voice, "God's house," she said, "God's prayers, God's songs of praise. He used them all to break a tender heart and bring an innocent life to ruin. And yet was he not struck dead?" Anne hid her face and shuddered. "He was a gentleman," the poor young thing cried, sobbing, "and I no fit match for him but that he loved me. 'Tis said love makes all equal, and he said I was the sweetest, innocent young thing, and without me he could not live. And he told my mother that he was not rich or the fashion now, and had no modish friends or relatives to flout any poor beauty he might choose to wed." "And he would marry you?" my lady's voice broke in. "He said that he would marry you?" "A thousand times, your ladyship, and so told my mother, but said I must come to town and be married at his lodgings, or 'twould not be counted a marriage by law, he being a town gentleman and I from the country." "And you came," said Mistress Anne, down whose pale cheeks the tears were running. You came at his command to follow him?" "What day came you up to town?" demands my lady, breathless and leaning forward. "Went you to his lodgings, and stayed you there with him even for an hour?" The poor child gazed at her, paling. "He was not there," she cried. "I came alone because he said all must be secret at first, and my heart beat so with joy, my lady, that when the woman of the house whereat he lodges let me in I scarce could speak. But she was a merry woman and good natured, and only laughed and cheered me when she took me to his rooms, and I sate trembling." "What said she to you?" my lady asks, her breast heaving with her breath. "That he was not yet in, but that he would sure come to such a young and pretty thing as I, and I must wait for him, for he would not forgive her if she let me go. And the while I waited there came a man in bands and cassock, but he had not a holy look, and late in the afternoon I heard him making jokes with the woman outside, and they both laughed in such an evil way that I was affrighted, and waiting till they had gone to another part of the house, stole away." "But he came not back that night, thank God," my lady said. "He came not back." The girl rose from her knees, trembling, her hands clasped on her breast. "Why should your ladyship thank God?" she says, pure drops falling from her eyes. "I am so humble, and had naught else but that great happiness, and it was taken away, and you thank God." Then drops fell from my lady's eyes also, and she came forward and caught the child's hand, and held it close and warm and strong, and yet with her full lip quivering. "'Twas not that your joy was taken away that I thanked God," she said. "I am not cruel, God Himself knows that, and when He smites me 'twill not be for cruelty. I knew not what I said, and yet tell me, what did you then? Tell me." "I went to a poor house to lodge, having some little money he had given me," the simple young thing answered. "'Twas an honest house, though mean and comfortless, and the next day I went back to his lodgings to question, but he had not come, and I would not go in, though the woman tried to make me enter, saying Sir John would surely return soon, as he had the day before rid with my Lady Dunstanwolde and been to her house, and 'twas plain he had meant to come to his lodgings, for her ladyship had sent her lacquey thrice with a message." The hand with which Mistress Anne sate covering her eyes began to shake. My lady's own hand would have shaken had she not been so strong a creature. "And has he not yet returned, then?" she asked. "You have not seen him?" The girl shook her fair locks, weeping with piteous little sobs. "He has not," she cried, "and I know not what to do, and the great town seems full of evil men and wicked women. I know not which way to turn, for all plot wrong against me and would drag me down to shamefulness, and back to my poor mother I cannot go." "Wherefore not, poor child?" my lady asked her. "I have not been made an honest wedded woman, and none would believe my story, and he might come back." "And if he came back?" said her ladyship. At this question the girl slipped from her grasp and down upon her knees again, catching at her rich petticoat and holding it, her eyes searching the great lady's in imploring piteousness, her own streaming. "I love him," she wept. "I love him so. I cannot leave the place where he might be. He was so beautiful and grand a gentleman, and, sure, he loved me better than all else, and I cannot thrust away from me that last night when he held me to his breast near our cottage door, and the nightingale sang in the roses, and he spake such words to me. I lie and sob all night on my hard pillow. I so long to see him and to hear his voice. And hearing he had been with you that last morning, I dared to come, praying that you might have heard him let drop some word that would tell me where he may be, for I cannot go away thinking he may come back longing for me, and I lose him and never see his face again. Oh, my lady, this place is so full of wickedness and fierce people, and dark kennels where crimes are done. I am affrighted for him, thinking he may have been struck some blow, and murdered, and hid away, and none will look for him but one who loves him, who loves him. Could it be so? Could it be? You know the town's ways so well. I pray you, tell me, in God's name I pray you." "God's mercy!" Anne breathed, and from behind her hands came stifled sobbing. My Lady Dunstanwolde bent down, her colour dying. "Nay, nay," she said, "there has been no murder done, none. Hush, poor thing, hush thee. There is somewhat I must tell thee." She tried to raise her, but the child would not be raised, and clung to her rich robe, shaking as she knelt gazing upward. "It is a bitter thing," my lady said, and 'twas as if her own eyes were imploring. "God help you bear it. God help us all. He told me nothing of his journey. I knew not he was about to take it, but wheresoever he has travelled, 'twas best that he should go." "Nay, nay," the girl cried out, "to leave me helpless. Nay, it could not be so. He loved me, as the great Duke loves you." "He meant you evil," said my lady, shuddering, "and evil he would have done you. He was a villain who meant to trick you. Had God struck him dead that day, 'twould have been a mercy to you. I knew him well." The young thing gave a bitter cry and fell swooning at her feet, and down upon her knees my lady went beside her, loosening her gown and chafing her poor hands as though they too had been of sister blood. "Call for hartshorn, Anne, and for water," she said. "She will come out of her swooning, poor child, and if she is cared for kindly in time her pain will pass away. God be thanked she knows no pain that cannot pass. I will protect her, ay, that will I, as I will protect all he hath done wrong to and deserted." She was so strangely kind through the poor victim's swoons and weeping that the very menials who were called to aid her went back to their hall wondering in their talk of the noble grandness of so great a lady, who on the very brink of her own joy could stoop to protect and comfort a creature so far beneath her, that to most ladies her sorrow and desertion would have been things which were too trivial to count. For 'twas guessed, and talked over with great freedom and much shrewdness, that this was a country victim of Sir John Oxon's, and he having deserted his creditors, was ready enough to desert his rustic beauty, finding her heavy on his hands. Below stairs the men closing the entrance to the passage with brick, having caught snatches of the servants' gossip, talked of what they heard among themselves as they did their work. "Ay, a noble lady indeed," they said, "for 'tis not a woman's way to be kindly with the cast off fancy of a man, even when she does not want him herself. He was her own worshipper for many a day, Sir John, and before she took the old Earl 'twas said that for a space people believed she loved him. She was but 15 and a high mettled beauty, and he was handsome as she, and had a blue eye that would melt any woman, but at 16 he was a town rake, and such tricks as this one he hath played since he was a lad. 'Tis well indeed for this poor thing her ladyship hath seen her. She hath promised to protect her, and sends her down to Dunstanwolde with her mother this very week. Would all fine ladies were of her kind. To hear such things of her puts a man in the humour to do her work well." CHapter XX of A Lady of Quality by Frances Hodgson Burnett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. CHAPTER XX. A Noble Marriage. When the Duke came back from France, and to pay his first eager visit to his bride that was to be, her ladyship's lacqueys led him not to the panelled parlour, but to a room which he had not entered before, it being one she had had the fancy to have remodelled and made into a beautiful closet for herself, her great wealth rendering it possible for her to accomplish changes without the loss of time the owners of limited purses are subjected to in the carrying out of plans. This room she had made as unlike the panelled parlour as two rooms would be unlike one another. Its panellings were white, its furnishings were bright and delicate, its draperies flowered with rosebuds tied in clusters with love knots of pink and blue. It had a large bow window, through which the sunlight streamed, and it was blooming with great rose bowls overrunning with sweetness. From a seat in the morning sunshine among the flowers and plants in the bow window there rose a tall figure in a snow white robe, a figure like that of a beautiful stately girl who was half an angel. It was my lady, who came to him with blushing cheeks and radiant shining eyes, and was swept into his arms in such a passion of love and blessed tenderness as heaven might have smiled to see. "My love, my love," he breathed, my life and soul." "My Gerald," she cried, "my Gerald, let me say it on your breast 1,000 times." "My wife," he said, "so soon my wife, and all my own until life's end." "Nay, nay," she cried, her cheeks pressed to his own, "through all eternity, for love's life knows no end." As it had seemed to her poor lord who had died, so it seemed to this man who lived and so worshipped her, that the wonder of her sweetness was a thing to marvel at with passionate reverence. Being a man of greater mind and poetic imagination than Dunstanwolde, and being himself adored by her, as that poor gentleman had not had the good fortune to be, he had 10,000-fold the power and reason to see the tender radiance of her. As she was taller than other women, so her love seemed higher and greater, and as free from any touch of earthly poverty of feeling as her beauty was from any flaw. In it there could be no doubt, no pride. It could be bounded by no limit, measured by no rule, its depths sounded by no plummet. His very soul was touched by her great longing to give to him the feeling, and to feel herself that from the hour that she had become his, her past life was a thing blotted out. "I am a new created thing," she said. "Until you called me love, I had no life. All before was darkness. 'Twas you, my Gerald, who said, 'Let there be light,' and there was light." "Hush, hush, sweet love," he said. "Your words would make me too near God's self." "Sure love is God," she cried, her hands upon his shoulders, her face uplifted. "What else? Love we know, love we worship and kneel to. Love conquers us and gives us heaven. Until I knew it, I believed naught. Now I kneel each night and pray, and pray, but to be pardoned and made worthy." Never before, it was true, had she knelt and prayed, but from this time no nun in her convent knelt oftener or prayed more ardently than her prayer was ever that the past might be forgiven her, the future blessed, and she taught how to so live that there should be no faintest shadow in the years to come. "I know not what is above me," she said. "I cannot lie and say I love it and believe. But if there is aught, sure it must be a power which is great, else had the world not been so strange a thing, and I, and those who live in it. And if He made us, He must know He is to blame when He has made us weak or evil. And He must understand why we have been so made, and when we throw ourselves into the dust before Him, and pray for help and pardon, surely, surely He will lend an ear. We know naught, we have been told naught. We have but an old book which has been handed down through strange hands and strange tongues, and may be but poor history. We have so little, and we are threatened so, but for love's sake I will pray the poor prayers we are given, and for love's sake there is no dust too low for me to lie in while I plead." This was the strange truth, though 'twas not so strange if the world feared not to admit such things, that through her Gerald, who was but noble and high souled man, she was led to bow before God's throne as the humblest and holiest saint bows, though she had not learned belief and had only learned love. "But life lasts so short a while," she said to Osmonde. "It seems so short when it is spent in such joy as this. And when the day comes for oh, Gerald, my soul sees it already when the day comes that I kneel by your bedside and see your eyes close, or you kneel by mine, it must be that the one who waits behind shall know the parting is not all." "It could not be all, beloved," Osmonde said. "Love is sure, eternal." Often in these blissful hours her way was almost like a child's, she was so tender and so clinging. At times her beauteous, great eyes were full of an imploring, which made them seem soft with tears, and thus they were now as she looked up at him. "I will do all I can," she said. "I will obey every law. I will pray often and give alms, and strive to be dutiful and holy, that in the end He will not thrust me from you, that I may stay near, even in the lowest place, even in the lowest, that I may see your face and know that you see mine. We are so in His power, He can do aught with us, but I will so obey Him and so pray that He will let me in." To Anne she went with curious humility, questioning her as to her religious duties and beliefs, asking her what books she read, and what services she attended. "All your life you have been a religious woman," she said. "I used to think it folly, but now " "But now?" said Anne. "I know not what to think," she answered. "I would learn." But when she listened to Anne's simple homilies and read her weighty sermons, they but made her restless and unsatisfied. "Nay, 'tis not that," she said one day with a deep sigh. "'Tis more than that. 'Tis deeper and greater, and your sermons do not hold it. They but set my brain to questioning and rebellion." But a short time elapsed before the marriage was solemnised, and such a wedding the world of fashion had not taken part in for years, 'twas said. Royalty honoured it, the greatest of the land were proud to count themselves among the guests. The retainers, messengers, and company of the two great houses were so numerous that in the west end of town The streets wore indeed quite a festal air, with the passing to and fro of servants and gentlefolk with favours upon their arms. 'Twas to the Tower of Camylott, the most beautiful and remote of the bridegroom's several notable seats, that they removed their household, when the irksomeness of the extended ceremonies and entertainments were over, for these they were of too distinguished rank to curtail as lesser personages might have done. But when all things were over, the stately town houses closed, and their equipages rolled out beyond the sight of town into the country roads, the great Duke and his great Duchess sat hand in hand, gazing into each other's eyes with as simple and ardent a joy as they had been but young 'prentice and country maid, flying to hide from the world their love. "There is no other woman who is so like a queen," Osmonde said, with tenderest smiling, "and yet your eyes wear a look so young in these days that they are like a child's. In all their beauty I have never seen them so before." "It is because I am a new created thing, as I have told you, love," she answered, and leaning towards him. "Do you not know I never was a child? I bring myself to you new born. Make of me then what a woman should be, to be beloved of a husband and of God. Teach me, my Gerald. I am your child and servant." 'Twas ever thus that her words when they were such as these were ended upon his breast as she was swept there by his impassioned arm. She was so goddess like and beautiful a being, her life one strangely dominant and brilliant series of triumphs, and yet she came to him with such softness and humility of passion that scarcely could he think of himself a waking man. "Surely," he said, "it is a thing too wondrous and too full of joy's splendour to be true." In the golden afternoon, when the sun was deepening and mellowing towards its setting, they and their retinue entered Camylott. The bells pealed from the grey belfry of the old church. The villagers came forth in clean smocks and Sunday cloaks of scarlet, and stood in the street and by the roadside, curtseying and baring their heads with rustic cheers. Little country girls with red cheeks threw posies before the horses' feet, and into the equipage itself when they were of the bolder sort. Their chariot passed beneath archways of flowers and boughs, and from the battlements of the Tower of Camylott there floated a flag in the soft wind. "God save your Graces!" the simple people cried. "God give your Graces joy and long life! Lord, what a beautiful pair they be, and though her Grace was said to be a proud lady, how sweet she smiles at a poor body! God love ye, madam, madam, God love ye!" Her Grace of Osmonde leaned forward in her equipage and smiled at the people with the face of an angel. "I will teach them to love me, Gerald," she said. "I have not had love enough." "Has not all the world loved you?" he said. "Nay," she answered, "only you and Dunstanwolde and Anne." Late at night they walked together on the broad terrace before the Tower. The blue black vault of heaven above them was studded with myriads of God's brilliants. Below them was spread out the beauty of the land, the rolling plains, the soft low hills, the forests and moors folded and hidden in the swathing robe of the night. From the park and gardens floated upward the freshness of acres of thick sward and deep fern thicket, the fragrance of roses and a thousand flowers, the tender sighing of the wind through the huge oaks and beeches bordering the avenues, and reigning like kings over the seeming boundless grassy spaces. As lovers have walked since the days of Eden, they walk together, no longer Duke and Duchess, but man and woman, near to Paradise as human beings may draw, until God breaks the chain binding them to earth. And, indeed, it would seem that such hours are given to the straining human soul that it may know that somewhere perfect joy must be, since sometimes the gates are for a moment opened, that heaven's light may shine through, so that human eyes may catch glimpses of the white and golden glories within. His arm held her. She leaned against him, their slow steps so harmonising the one with the other that they accorded with the harmony of music. The nightingales trilling and bubbling in the rose trees were not affrighted by the low murmur of their voices. Perchance this night they were so near to nature that the barriers were o'erpassed, and they and the singers were akin. "Oh, to be a woman!" Clorinda murmured. "To be a woman at last! All other things I have been, and have been called huntress, goddess, beauty, empress, conqueror, but never woman. And had our paths not crossed, I think I never could have known what was to be one, for to be a woman one must close with the man who is one's mate. It must not be that one looks down, or only pities, or protects and guides. And only to a few a mate seems given. And I, Gerald, how dare I walk thus at your side, and feel your heart so beat near mine, and know you love me, and so worship you, so worship you." She turned and threw herself upon his breast which was so near. "Oh, woman, woman!" he breathed, straining her close. "Oh, woman, who is mine, though I am but man!" "We are but one," she said, "one breath, one soul, one thought, and one desire. Were it not so, I were not woman and your wife, nor you man and my soul's lover as you are. If it were not so, we were still apart, though we were wedded 1,000 times. Apart, what are we but like lopped off limbs? Welded together we are this." And for a moment they spoke not, and a nightingale on the rose vine, clambering over the terrace's balustrade, threw up its little head and sang as if to the myriads of golden stars. They stood and listened, hand in hand. Her sweet breast rose and fell, her lovely face was lifted to the bespangled sky. "Of all this," she said, "I am a part, as I am a part of you. To night, as the great earth throbs, and as the stars tremble, and as the wind sighs, so I, being woman, throb and am tremulous and sigh also. The earth lives for the sun, and through strange mysteries blooms forth each season with fruits and flowers. Love is my sun, and through its sacredness I may bloom too, and be as noble as the earth, and that it bears." End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of A Lady of Quality by Frances Hodgson Burnett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 21 An Heir is Born. In a fair tower, whose windows looked out upon spreading woods, and rich lovely plains stretching to the freshness of the sea, Mistress Anne had her abode, which her Duchess sister had given to her for her own living in as she would. There she dwelt and prayed, and looked on the new life which so beauteously unfolded itself before her day by day, as the leaves of a great tree unfold from buds and become noble branches, housing birds in their nests, shading the earth and those sheltering beneath them, braving centuries of storms. To this simile her simple mind oft reverted, for indeed it seemed to her that naught more perfect and more noble in its high likeness to pure nature and the fulfilling of God's will than the passing days of these two lives could be. As the first two lived, Adam and Eve in their Garden of Eden, they seemed to me, she used to say in her own heart, but the tree of knowledge was not forbidden them, and it has taught them naught ignoble. As she had been wont to watch her sister from behind the ivy of her chamber windows, so she often watched her now, though there was no fear in her hiding, only tenderness, it being a pleasure to her full of wonder and of reverence to see this beautiful and stately pair go lovingly and in high and gentle converse side by side, up and down the terrace, through the paths, among the beds of flowers, under the thick branched trees, and over the sward's softness. "It is as if I saw Love's self, and dwelt with it, the love God's nature made," she said, with gentle sighs. For if these two had been great and beauteous before, it seemed in these days as if life and love glowed within them, and shone through their mere bodies as a radiant light shines through alabaster lamps. The strength of each was so the being of the other that no thought could take form in the brain of one without the other's stirring with it. "Neither of us dare be ignoble," Osmonde said, "for 'twould make poor and base the one who was not so in truth. 'Twas not the way of my Lady Dunstanwolde to make a man feel that he stood in church," a frivolous court wit once said, "but in sooth her Grace of Osmonde has a look in her lustrous eyes which accords not with scandalous stories and playhouse jests." And true it was that when they went to town they carried with them the illumining of the pure fire which burned within their souls, and bore it all unknowing in the midst of the trivial or designing world, which knew not what it was that glowed about them, making things bright which had seemed dull, and revealing darkness where there had been brilliant glare. They returned not to the house which had been my Lord of Dunstanwolde's, but went to the Duke's own great mansion, and there lived splendidly and in hospitable state. Royalty honoured them, and all the wits came there, some of those gentlemen who writ verses and dedications being by no means averse to meeting noble lords and ladies, and finding in their loves and graces material which might be useful. 'Twas not only Mr. Addison and Mr. Steele, Dr. Swift and Mr. Pope, who were made welcome in the stately rooms, but others who were more humble, not yet having won their spurs, and how these worshipped her Grace for the generous kindness which was not the fashion, until she said it, among great ladies, their odes and verses could scarce express. "They are so poor," she said to her husband, "they are so poor, and yet in their starved souls there is a thing which can less bear flouting than the dull content which rules in others. I know not whether 'tis a curse or a boon to be born so. 'Tis a bitter thing when the bird that flutters in them has only little wings. All the more should those who are strong protect and comfort them." She comforted so many creatures. In strange parts of the town, where no other lady would have dared to go to give alms, it was rumoured that she went and did noble things privately. In dark kennels, where thieves hid and vagrants huddled, she carried her beauty and her stateliness. the which, when they shone on the poor rogues and victims housed there, seemed like beams of the warm and golden sun. Once in a filthy hovel in a black alley she came upon a poor girl dying of a loathsome ill, and as she stood by her bed of rags she heard in her delirium the uttering of one man's name again and again, and when she questioned those about she found that the sufferer had been a little country wench enticed to town by this man for a plaything, and in a few weeks cast off to give birth to a child in the almshouse, and then go down to the depths of vice in the kennel. "What is the name she says?" her Grace asked the hag nearest her, and least maudlin with liquor. "I would be sure I heard it aright." "'Tis the name of a gentleman, your ladyship may be sure," the beldam answered. "'Tis always the name of a gentleman, and this is one I know well, for I have heard more than one poor soul mumbling it and raving at him in her last hours. One there was, and I knew her, a pretty rosy thing in her country days, not 16, and distraught with love for him, and lay in the street by his door praying him to take her back when he threw her off, until the watch drove her away. And she was so mad with love and grief she killed her girl child when 'twas born in the kennel, sobbing and crying that it should not live to be like her and bear others. And she was condemned to death and swung for it on Tyburn Tree, and Lord, how she cried his name as she jolted on her coffin to the gallows. And when the hangman put the rope round her shuddering little fair neck, 'Oh, John!' screams she, 'John Oxon, God forgive thee!' Nay, 'tis God should be forgiven for letting thee to live and me to die like this. Ay, 'twas a bitter sight. She was so little and so young, and so affrighted. The hangman could scarce hold her. I was in the midst of the crowd and cried to her to strive to stand still, 'twould be the sooner over. But that she could not. 'Oh, John!' she screams, 'John Oxon, God forgive thee! Nay, 'tis God should be forgiven for letting thee to live and me to die like this.' Till the last hour of the poor creature who lay before her when she heard this thing, her Grace of Osmonde saw that she was tended, took her from her filthy hovel, putting her in a decent house, and going to her day by day until she received her last breath, holding her hand while the poor wretch lay staring up at her beauteous face and her great deep eyes, whose lustrousness held such power to sustain, protect, and comfort. "Be not afraid, poor soul," she said. "Be not afraid. I will stay near thee. Soon all will end in sleep, and if thou wakest, sure there will be Christ who died and wipes all tears away. Hear me say it to thee for a prayer." And she bent low and said it soft and clear into the deadening ear. "He wipes all tears away. He wipes all tears away." The great strength she had used in the old days to conquer and subdue, to win her will and to defend her way, seemed now a power but to protect the suffering and uphold the weak, and this she did, not alone in hovels, but in the brilliant court and world of fashion, for there she found suffering and weakness also, all the more bitter and sorrowful since it dared not cry aloud. The grandeur of her beauty, the elevation of her rank, the splendour of her wealth would have made her a protector of great strength, but that which upheld all those who turned to her was that which dwelt within the high soul of her, the courage and power of love for all things human, which bore upon itself, as if upon an eagle's outspread wings, the woes dragging themselves, broken and halting upon earth. The starving beggar in the kennel felt it, and, not knowing wherefore, drew a longer, deeper breath, as if of purer, more exalted air. The poor poet in his garret was fed by it, and having stood near or spoken to her, went back to his lair with lightning eyes and soul warmed to believe that the words his muse might speak the world might stay to hear. From the hour she stayed the last moments of John Oxon's victim she set herself a work to do. None knew it but herself at first, and later Anne, for 'twas done privately. From the hag who had told her of the poor girl's hanging upon Tyburn Tree, she learned things by close questioning which to the old woman's dull wit seemed but the curiousness of a great lady, and from others who stood too deep in awe of her to think of her as a mere human being, she gathered clues which led her far in the tracing of the evils following one wicked, heartless life. Where she could hear of man, woman, or child on whom John Oxon's sins had fallen, or who had suffered wrong by him, there she went to help, to give light, to give comfort and encouragement. Strangely as it seemed to them, and as if done by the hand of Heaven, the poor tradesmen he had robbed were paid their dues. Youth he had led into evil ways was checked mysteriously and set in better paths. Women he had dragged downward were given aid and chance of peace or happiness. Children he had cast upon the world, unfathered and with no prospect but the education of the gutter and a life of crime, were cared for by a powerful unseen hand. The pretty country girl saved by his death, protected by her Grace, and living innocently at Dunstanwolde, memory being merciful to youth, forgot him, gained back her young roses, and learned to smile and hope as though he had been but a name. "Since 'twas I who killed him," said her Grace to her inward soul, "'tis I must live his life which I took from him, and making it better I may be forgiven. If there is one who dares to say to the poor thing he made, I will not forgive." Surely it was said that there had never been lives so beautiful and noble as those of the Duke of Osmonde and his lady lived as time went by. The Tower of Camylott, where they had spent the first months of their wedded life, they loved better than any other of their seats, and there they spent as much time as their duties of Court and State allowed them. It was indeed a splendid and beautiful estate, the stately tower being built upon an eminence, and there, rolling out before it the most lovely land in England, moorland and hills, thick woods and broad meadows, the edge of the heather dipping to show the soft silver of the sea. Here was this beauteous woman, chatelaine and queen, wife of her husband as never before, he thought, had wife blessed and glorified the existence of mortal man. All her great beauty she gave to him in tender, joyous tribute. All her great gifts of mind and wit and grace it seemed she valued but as they were joys to him. In his stately households in town and country she reigned a lovely empress, adored and obeyed with reverence by every man or woman who served her and her lord. Among the people on his various estates she came and went a tender goddess of benevolence. When she appeared amid them in the first months of her wedded life, the humble souls regarded her with awe not unmixed with fear, having heard such wild stories of her youth at her father's house, and of her proud state and bitter wit in the great London world when she had been my Lady Dunstanwolde. But when she came among them all else was forgotten in their wonder at her graciousness and noble way. To see her come into a poor body's cottage, so tall and grand a lady, and with such carriage as she hath, they said, hobnobbing together in their talk of her, looking as if a crown of gold should sit on her high black head, and then to hear her gentle speech and see the look in her eyes as if she was but a simple new married girl, full of her joy, and her heart big with the wish that all other women should be as happy as herself. It is, forsooth, a beauteous sight to see. Ay, and no hovel too poor for her, and no man or woman too sinful, was said again. Heard ye how she found that poor wench of Haylitz lying sobbing among the fern in the Tower woods, and stayed and knelt beside her to hear her trouble? The poor soul had gone to ruin at 14, and her father, finding her out, beat her and thrust her from his door, and her Grace coming through the wood at sunset, it being her way to walk about for mere pleasure as though she had no coach to ride in. The girl says she came through the golden glow as if she had been one of God's angels, and she kneeled and took the poor wench in her arms, as strong as a man, Betty says, but as soft as a young mother, and she said to her things surely no mortal lady ever said before, that she knew naught of a surety of what God's true will might be, or if his laws were those that have been made by man concerning marriage, by priests, saying common words, but that she surely knew of a man whose name was Christ, and he had taught love and helpfulness and pity, and for his sake, he having earned our trust in him, whether he was God or man, because he hung and died in awful torture on the cross, for his sake, all of us must love and help and pity. I you, poor Betty, were her very words, and you me. And then she went to the girl's father and mother, and so talked to them that she brought them to weeping, and begging Betty to come home. And also she went to her sweetheart, Tom Beck, and made so tender a story to him of the poor pretty wench whose love for him had brought her to such trouble, that she stirred him up to falling in love again, which is not man's way at such times, and in a week's time he and Betty went to church together, her Grace setting them up in a cottage on the estate. I used all my wit and all my tenderest words to make a picture that would fire and touch him, Gerald," her Grace said, sitting at her husband's side in a great window from which they often watched the sunset in the valley spread below. "And that which I am so strong sometimes, I know not what to call it, but 'tis a power people bend to that I know, that I used upon him to waken his dull soul and brain. Whose fault is it that they are dull? Poor lout, he was born so, as I was born strong and passionate, and as you were born noble and pure and high. I led his mind back to the past, when he had been made happy by the sight of Betty's little smiling, blushing face, and when he had kissed her and made love in the hayfields. And this I said, though 'twas not a thing I have learned from any chaplain, that when 'twas said he should make an honest woman of her, it was my thought that she had been honest from the first, being too honest to know that the world was not so, and that even the man a woman loved with all her soul might be a rogue, and have no honesty in him. And at last, 'twas when I talked to him about the child, and that I put my whole soul's strength in it, he burst out a crying like a schoolboy, and said indeed she was a fond little thing and had loved him, and he had loved her, and 'twas a shame he had so done by her, and he had not meant it at the first, but she was so simple, and he had been a villain. But if he married her now, he would be called a fool and laughed at for his pains. Then I was angry, Gerald, and felt my eyes flash, and I stood up tall and spoke fiercely. 'Let them dare,' I said. 'Let any man or woman dare, and then will they see what his Grace will say." Osmond drew her to his breast, laughing into her lovely eyes. "Nay, 'tis not his Grace who need be called on," he said. "'Tis her Grace they love and fear, and will obey, though 'tis the sweetest womanish thing that you should call on me when you are a power itself, and can so rule all creatures you come near." "Nay," she said, with softly pleading face, "let me not rule. Rule for me, or but help me. I so long to say your name that they may know I speak but as your wife." "Who is myself?" he answered. "My very self." "Ay," she said, with a little nod of her head, "that I know, that I am yourself, and 'tis because of this that one of us cannot be proud without the other. For there is no other, there is only one. And I am wrong to say, let me not rule, for 'tis as if I said, you must not rule. I meant surely, God give me strength to be as noble in ruling as our love should make me. But just as one tree is a beech, and one an oak, just as the grass stirs when the summer wind blows over it, so a woman is a woman, and 'tis her nature to find her joy in saying such words to the man who loves her, when she loves as I do. Her heart is so full that she must joy to say her husband's name as that of one she cannot think without, who is her life, as is her blood and her pulses beating. 'Tis a joy to say your name, Gerald, as it will be a joy," and she looked far out across the sun golden valley and plains with a strange, heavenly sweet smile, "as it will be a joy to say our child's and put his little mouth to my full breast." "Sweet love!" he cried, drawing her by the hand that he might meet the radiance of her look. "Heart's dearest!" She did not withhold her lovely eyes from him, but withdrew them from the sunset's mist of gold, and the clouds piled, as it were, at the gates of heaven, and they seemed to bring back some of the far off glory with them. Indeed, neither her smile nor she seemed at that moment to be things of earth. She held out her fair noble arms, and he sprang to her, and so they stood, side beating against side. "Yes, love," she said. "Yes, love, and I have prayed, my Gerald, that I may give you sons who shall be men like you. But when I give you women children, I pray with all my soul for them, that they may be just and strong and noble, and life begin for them as it began not for me." In the morning of a spring day, when the cuckoos cried in the woods, and May blossomed thick, white and pink, in all the hedges, the bells in the grey church steeple at Camylott rang out a joyous, jangling peal, telling all the village that the heir had been born at the Tower. Children stopped in their play to listen, men at work in field and barn, good gossips ran out of their cottage door, wiping their arms dry from their tubs and scrubbing buckets, their honest red faces broadening into maternal grins. "Ay, 'tis well over, that means surely," one said to the other, "and a happy day has begun for the poor lady, though God knows she bore herself queenly to the very last, as if she could have carried her burden for another year, and blenched not a bit as other women do. Bless mother and child, say I." "And 'tis an heir," said another. "She promised us that we should know almost as quick as she did, and commanded old Rowe to ring a peal and then strike one bell loud between if 'twere a boy, and two if 'twere a girl child. 'Tis a boy, heard you, and 'twas like her wit to invent such a way to tell us." In 4 other villages the chimes rang just as loud and merrily, and the women talked and blessed her Grace and her young child, and casks of ale were broached, and oxen roasted, and work stopped, and dancers footed it upon the green. "Surely the new born thing comes here to happiness," 'twas said everywhere, "for never yet was a woman loved as is his mother." In her stately bed her Grace the Duchess lay, with the face of the Mother Mary, and her man child drinking from her breast. The Duke walked softly up and down, so full of joy that he could not sit still. When he had entered first, it was his wife's self who had sat upright in her bed, and herself laid his son within his arms. "None other shall lay him there," she said. "I have given him to you. He is a great child, but he has not taken from me my strength." He was indeed a great child, even at his first hour, of limbs and countenance so noble that nurses and physicians regarded him amazed. He was the offspring of a great love, of noble bodies and great souls. Did such powers alone create human beings, the earth would be peopled with a race of giants. Amid the veiled spring sunshine and the flower scented silence, broken only by the twittering of birds nesting in the ivy, her Grace lay soft asleep, her son resting on her arm, when Anne stole to look at her and her child. Through the night she had knelt praying in her chamber, and now she knelt again. She kissed the new born thing's curled rose leaf hand and the lace frill of his mother's night rail. She dared not further disturb them. "Sure God forgives," she breathed, "for Christ's sake. He would not give this little tender thing a punishment to bear." End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of A Lady of Quality by Frances Hodgson Burnett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 22. Mother Anne. There was no punishment. The tender little creature grew as a blossom grows from bud to fairest bloom. His mother flowered as he, and spent her days in noble cherishing of him and tender care. Such motherhood and wifehood as were hers were as fair statues raised to Nature's self. "Once I thought that I was under ban," she said to her lord in one of their sweetest hours, "but I have been given love and a life, and so I know it cannot be. Do I fill all your being, Gerald?" "All, all," he cried, "my sweet, sweet woman." "Leave I no longing unfulfilled, no duty undone, to you, dear love, to the world, to human suffering I might aid? I pray Christ with all passionate humbleness that I may not." "He grants your prayer," he answered, his eyes moist with worshipping tenderness. "And this white soul given to me from the outer bounds we know not, it has no stain, and the little human body it wakened to life in, think you that Christ will help me to fold them in love high and pure enough, and teach the human body to do honour to its soul? 'Tis not monkish scorn of itself that I would teach the body, it is so beautiful and noble a thing, and so full of the power of joy. Surely that which made it, in His own image, would not that it should despise itself and its own wonders, but do them reverence, and rejoice in them nobly, knowing all their seasons and their changes, counting not youth folly, and manhood sinful, or age aught but gentle ripeness passing onward? I pray for a great soul and great wit and greater power to help this fair human thing to grow and love and live." These had been born and had rested hid within her when she lay a babe struggling 'neath her dead mother's corpse. Through the darkness of untaught years they had grown but slowly, being so unfitly and unfairly nourished, but life's sun but falling on her, they seemed to strive to fair fruition with her days. 'Twas not mere love she gave her offspring, for she bore others as years passed, until she was the mother of 4 sons and 2 girls, children of strength and beauty as noted as her own. She gave them of her constant thought, and in honour of their humanity such as taught them reverence of themselves as of all other human things. Their love for her was such a passion as their father bore her. She was the noblest creature that they knew. Her beauty, her great unswerving love, her truth, were things bearing to their child eyes the unchangingness of God's stars in heaven. "Why is she not the Queen?" a younger one asked his father once, having been to London and seen the court. "The Queen is not so beautiful and grand as she, and she could so well reign over the people. She is always just and honourable, and fears nothing." From her side Mistress Anne was rarely parted. In her fair retreat at Camylott she had lived a life all undisturbed by outward things. When the children were born, strange joy came to her. "Be his mother also," the Duchess had said, when she had drawn the clothes aside to show her firstborn sleeping in her arm. "You were made to be the mother of things, Anne." "Nay, or they had been given to me," Anne had answered. "Mine I will share with you," her Grace had said, lifting her Madonna face. "Kiss me, sister. Kiss him, too, and bless him. Your life has been so innocent it must be good that you should love and guard him." 'Twas sweet to see the wit she showed in giving to poor Anne the feeling that she shared her motherhood. She shared her tenderest cares and duties with her. Together they bathed and clad the child in the morning, this being their high festival, in which the nurses shared but in the performance of small duties. Each day they played with him and laughed as women will at such dear times, kissing his grand round limbs, crying out at their growth, worshipping his little rosy feet, and smothering him with caresses. And then they put him to sleep, Anne sitting close while his mother fed him from her breast until his small red mouth parted and slowly released her. When he could toddle about and was beginning to say words, there was a morning when she bore him to Anne's tower that they might joy in him together, as was their way. It was a beautiful thing to see her walk carrying him in the strong and lovely curve of her arm, as if his sturdy babyhood were of no more weight than a rose, and he cuddling against her, clinging and crowing, his wide brown eyes shining with delight. "He has come to pay thee court, Anne," she said. "He is a great gallant, and knows how we are his loving slaves. He comes to say his new word that I have taught him." She set him down where he stood holding to Anne's knee and showing his new pearl teeth in a rosy grin. His mother knelt beside him, beginning her coaxing. "Who is she?" she said, pointing with her finger at Anne's face, her own full of lovely fear lest the child should not speak rightly his lesson. "What is her name? Mammy's man say," and she mumbled softly with her crimson mouth at his ear. The child looked up at Anne with baby wit and laughter in his face, and stammered sweetly. "Muzzer, Anne," he said, and then being pleased with his cleverness, danced on his little feet and said it over and over. Clorinda caught him up and set him on Anne's lap. "Know you what he calls you?" she said. "'Tis but a mumble, his little tongue is not nimble enough for clearness, but he says it his pretty best. 'Tis Mother Anne, he says, 'tis Mother Anne." And then they were in each other's arms, the child between them, he kissing both and clasping both, with little laughs of joy, as if they were but one creature. Each child born they clasped and kissed so, and were so clasped and kissed by, each one calling the tender unwed woman Mother Anne, and having a special lovingness for her, she being the creature each one seemed to hover about with innocent protection and companionship. The wonder of Anne's life grew deeper to her hour by hour, and where she had before loved, she learned to worship, for 'twas indeed worship that her soul was filled with. She could not look back and believe that she had not dreamed a dream of all the fears gone by and that they held. This was true. The beauty of these days, the love of them, the generous deeds, the sweet courtesies and gentle words spoken. This beauteous woman dwelling in her husband's heart, giving him all joy of life and love, ruling queenly and gracious in his house, bearing him noble children, and tending them with the very genius of tenderness and wisdom. But in Mistress Anne herself life had never been strong. She was of the fibre of her mother, who had died in youth, crushed by its cruel weight, and to her living had been so great and terrible a thing. There had not been given to her the will to battle with the fate that fell to her, brain to reason and disentangle problems, or the power to set them aside. So while her Grace of Osmonde seemed but to gain greater state and beauty in her ripening, her sister's frail body grew more frail and seemed to shrink and age. Yet her face put on a strange worn sweetness, and her soft dull eyes had a look almost like a saint's who looks at heaven. She prayed much, and did many charitable works both in town and country. She read her books of devotion, and went much to church, sitting with a reverent face through many a dull and lengthy sermon she would have felt it sacrilege to think of with aught but pious admiration. In the middle of the night it was her custom to rise and offer up prayers through the dark hours. She was an humble soul, who greatly feared and trembled before her God. "I waken in the night sometimes," the fair tall child Daphne had said once to her mother, "and Mother Anne is there. She kneels and prays beside my bed. She kneels and prays so by each one of us many a night." "'Tis because she is so pious a woman and so loves us," said young John, in his stately, generous way. The house of Osmonde had never had so fine and handsome a creature for its heir. He o'ertopped every boy of his age in height, and the bearing of his lovely youthful body was masculine grace itself. The town and the court knew these children, and talked of their beauty and growth as they had talked of their mother's. To be the mate of such a woman, the father of such heirs, is a fate a man might pray God for, 'twas said. Love has not grown stale with them. Their children are the very blossoms of it. Her eyes are deeper pools of love each year. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of A Lady of Quality by Frances Hodgson Burnett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 23 In one who will do justice and demands that it shall be done to each thing he has made by each who bears his image. 'Twas in these days Sir Jeoffry came to his end, it being in such a way as had been often prophesied, and when his final hour came, there was but one who could give him comfort, and this was the daughter whose youth he had led with such careless evilness to harm. If he had wondered at her when she had been my Lady Dunstanwolde, as her Grace of Osmonde he regarded her with heavy awe. Never had she been able to lead him to visit her at her house in town, or at any other which was her home. "'Tis all too grand for me, your Grace," he would say. "I am a country yokel, and have hunted and drunk and lived too hard to look well among town gentlemen. I must be drunk at dinner, and when I am in liquor I am no ornament to a duchess' drawing room. But what a woman you have grown," he would say, staring at her and shaking his head. "Each time I clap eyes on you 'tis to marvel at you, remembering what a baggage you were, and how you kept from slipping by the way. There was Jack Oxon now," he added one day, "after you married Dunstanwolde, I heard a pretty tale of Jack, that he had made a wager among his friends in town he was a braggart devil, Jack that he would have you, though you were so scornful, and knowing him to be a liar, his fellows said that unless he could bring back a raven lock 6 feet long to show them, he had lost his bet, for they would believe no other proof. And finally they scoffed at him when he came back, saying that he had one, but had hid it away for safety when he was drunk, and could not find it again. They so flouted and jeered at him that swords were drawn, and blood as well. But though he was a beauty and a crafty rake-hell fellow, you were too sharp for him. Had you not had so shrewd a wit and strong a will, you would not have been the greatest duchess in England, Clo, as well as the finest woman." "Nay," she answered, "in those days nay, let us not speak of them. I would blot them out out." As time went by and the years spent in drink and debauchery began to tell on even the big strong body which should have served any other man bravely long past his 70, Sir Jeoffry drank harder and lived more wildly, sometimes being driven desperate by dulness, his coarse pleasures having lost their potency. "Liquor is not as strong as it once was," he used to grumble, "and there are fewer things to stir a man to frolic. Lord, what roaring days and nights a man could have 30 years ago." So in his efforts to emulate such nights and days he plunged deeper and deeper into new orgies, and one night, after a heavy day's hunting, sitting at the head of his table with his old companions, he suddenly leaned forward, staring with starting eyes at an empty chair in a dark corner. His face grew purple, and he gasped and gurgled. "What is it, Jeoff?" old Eldershawe cried, touching his shoulder with a shaking hand. "What's the man staring at, as if he had gone mad?" "Jack!" cried Sir Jeoffry, his eyes still farther starting from their sockets. "Jack! What say you? I cannot hear." The next instant he sprang up, shrieking, and thrusting with his hands as if warding something off. "Keep back!" he yelled. "There is green mould on thee. Where hast thou been to grow mouldy? Keep back! Where hast thou been?" His friends at table started up, staring at him and losing colour. He shrieked so loud and strangely, he clutched his hair with his hands, and fell into his chair, raving, clutching and staring, or dashing his head down upon the table to hide his face, and then raising it as if he could not resist being drawn in his affright to gaze again. There was no soothing him. He shouted and struggled with those who would have held him. 'Twas Jack Oxon who was there, he swore, Jack who kept stealing slowly nearer to him, his face and his fine clothes damp and green. He beat at the air with mad hands, and at last fell upon the floor and rolled, foaming at the mouth. They contrived, after great struggles, to bear him to his chamber, but it took the united strength of all who would stay near him to keep him from making an end of himself. By the dawn of day his boon companions stood by him with their garments torn to tatters, their faces drenched with sweat, and their own eyes almost starting from their sockets. The doctor who had been sent for, coming in no hurry, but scowled and shook his head when he beheld him. "He is a dead man," he said, "and the wonder is that this has not come before. He is sodden with drink and rotten with ill living besides being past all the strength of youth. He dies of the life he has lived." 'Twas little to be expected that his boon companions could desert their homes and pleasures and tend his horrors longer than a night. Such a sight as he presented did not inspire them to cheerful spirits. "Lord," said Chris Crowell, "to see him clutch his flesh and shriek in mouth is enough to make a man live sober for his remaining days," and he shook his big shoulders with a shudder. "Ugh!" he said. "God grant I make a better end. He writhes in hell fire." "There is but one on earth who will do aught for him," said Eldershawe. "'Tis handsome Clo, who is a duchess. But she will come and tend him, I could swear. Even when she was a lawless devil of a child she had a way of standing by her friends and fearing naught." So after taking counsel together they sent for her, and in as many hours as it took to drive from London her coach stood before the door. By this time all the household was panic stricken and in hopeless disorder, the women servants scattered and shuddering in far corners of the house, such men as could get out of the way having found work to do afield or in the kennels, for none had nerve to stay where they could hear the madman's shrieks and howls. Her Grace, entering the house, went with her women straight to her chamber, and shortly emerged therefrom, stripped of her rich apparel, and clad in a gown of strong blue linen, her hair wound close, her white hands bare of any ornament save the band of gold which was her wedding ring. A serving woman might have been clad so, but the plainness of her garb made her height and strength so reveal themselves that the mere sight of her woke somewhat that was like to awe in the eyes of the servants who beheld her as she passed. She needed not to be led, but straightway followed the awful sounds until she reached the chamber behind whose door they were shut. Upon the huge disordered bed Sir Jeoffry writhed and tried to tear himself, his great sinewy and hairy body almost stark. Two of the stablemen were striving to hold him. The Duchess went to his bedside and stood there, laying her strong white hand upon his shuddering shoulder. "Father," she said, in a voice so clear and with such a ring of steady command, as the men said later, might have reached a dead man's ear. "Father, 'tis Clo." Sir Jeoffry writhed his head round and glared at her, with starting eyes and foaming mouth. "Who says 'tis Clo?" he shouted. "'Tis a lie. She was an even bigger devil than the other, though she was but a handsome wench. Jack himself could not manage her. She beat him, and would beat him now. 'Tis a lie." All through that day and night the power of her Grace's white arm was the thing which saved him from dashing out his brains. The two men could not have held him, and at his greatest frenzy they observed that now and then his bloodshot eye would glance aside at the beauteous face above him. The sound of the word Clo had struck upon his brain and wakened an echo. She sent away the men to rest, calling for others in their places, but leave the bedside herself she would not. 'Twas a strange thing to see her strength and bravery, which could not be beaten down. When the doctor came again he found her there, and changed his surly and reluctant manner in the presence of a duchess, and one who in her close linen gown wore such a mien. "You should not have left him," she said to him unbendingly, "even though I myself can see there is little help that can be given. Thought you his Grace and I would brook that he should die alone if we could not have reached him?" Those words, "his Grace and I," put a new face upon the matter, and all was done that lay within the man's skill, but most was he disturbed concerning the lady, who would not be sent to rest, and whose noble consort would be justly angered if she were allowed to injure her superb health. "His Grace knew what I came to do, and how I should do it," the Duchess said, unbending still. "But for affairs of state which held him, he would have been here at my side." She held her place throughout the second night, and that was worse than the first, the paroxysms growing more and more awful, for Jack was within a yard and stretched out a green and mouldy hand, the finger bones showing through the flesh, the while he smiled awfully. At last one pealing scream rang out after another, until after making his shuddering body into an arc resting on heels and head, the madman fell exhausted, his flesh all quaking before the eye. Then the Duchess waved the men who helped away. She sat upon the bed's edge close to her father's body, putting her two firm hands on either of his shoulders, holding him so, and bent down, looking into his wild face, as if she fixed upon his very soul all the power of her wondrous will. "Father," she said, "look at my face. Thou canst if thou wilt. Look at my face. Then wilt thou see 'tis Clo, and she will stand by thee." She kept her gaze upon his very pupils, and though 'twas at first as if his eyes strove to break away from her look, their effort was controlled by her steadfastness, and they wandered back at last, and her great orbs held them. He heaved a long breath, half a big broken sob, and lay still, staring up at her. "Ay," he said, "'tis Clo, 'tis Clo." The sweat began to roll from his forehead and the tears down his cheeks. He broke forth, wailing like a child. "Clo, Clo," he said, "I am in hell." She put her hand on his breast, keeping will and eyes set on him. "Nay," she answered, "thou art on earth and in thine own bed, and I am here and will not leave thee." She made another sign to the men, who stood and stared aghast in wonder at her, but feeling in the very air about her the spell to which the madness had given way. "'Twas not mere human woman who sat there," they said afterwards in the stables among their fellows. "'Twas somewhat more. Had such a will been in an evil thing a man's hair would have risen on his skull at the seeing of it." "Go now," she said to them, "and send women to set the place in order." She had seen delirium and death enough in the doings of her deeds of mercy to know that his strength had gone and death was coming. His bed and room were made orderly, and at last he lay in clean linen, with all made straight. Soon his eyes seemed to sink into his head and stare from hollows, and his skin grew grey, but ever he stared only at his daughter's face. "Clo," he said at last, "stay by me. Clo, do not away." "I shall not go," she answered. She drew a seat close to his bed and took his hand. It lay knotted and gnarled and swollen veined upon her smooth palm, and with her other hand she stroked it. His breath came weak and quick, and fear grew in his eyes. "What is it, Clo?" he said. "What is it?" "'Tis weakness," replied she, soothing him. "Soon you will sleep." "Ay," he said, and with a breath like a sob, "'tis over." His big body seemed to collapse, he shrank so in the bedclothes. "What day o' the year is it?" he asked. "The 10th of August," was her answer. "69 years from this day was I born," he said, "and now 'tis done." "Nay," said she, "nay, God grant " "Ay," he said, "done. Would there were 69 more. What a man I was at 20. I want not to die, Clo. I want to live live and be young," gulping, "with strong muscle and moist flesh. 69 years and they are gone." He clung to her hand and stared at her with awful eyes. Through all his life he had been but a great strong human carcass, and he was now but the same carcass, worn out, and at death's door. Of not one human thing but of himself had he ever thought, not one creature but himself had he ever loved, and now he lay at the end, harking back only to the wicked years gone by. "None can bring them back," he shuddered. "Not even thou, Clo, who art so strong. None, none. Canst pray, Clo?" with the gasp of a craven. "Not as chaplains do," she answered. "I believe not in a God who clamours but for praise." "What dost believe in, then?" "In One who will do justice, and demands that it shall be done to each thing He has made, by each who bears His image. Ay, and mercy too, but justice always, for justice is mercy's highest self. Who knows the mysteries of the human soul? Who knows the workings of the human brain? The God who is just alone. In this man's mind, which was so near a simple beast's in all its movings, some remote, unborn consciousness was surely reached and vaguely set astir by the clear words thus spoken. "Clo, Clo!" he cried. "Clo, Clo!" in terror, clutching her closer. "What dost thou mean? In all my 69 years," and rolled his head in agony. In all his 69 years he had shown justice to no man, mercy to no woman, since he had thought of none but Jeoffry Wildairs, and this truth somehow dimly reached his long dulled brain and wakened there. "Down on thy knees, Clo," he gasped. "Down on thy knees." It was so horrible, the look struggling in his dying face, that she went down upon her knees that moment, and so knelt, folding his shaking hands within her own against her breast. "Thou who didst make him as he was born into thy world," she said, "deal with that to which thou didst give life and death. Show him in this hour, which thou madest also, that thou art not man who would have vengeance, but that justice which is God." Then," he gasped, "then he will damn me." "He will weigh thee," she said, "and that which his own hand created will he separate from that which was thine own wilful wrong, and this, sure, he will teach thee how to expiate." "Clo," he cried again, "thy mother, she was but a girl and died alone. I did no justice to her. Daphne, Daphne," and he shook beneath the bedclothes, shuddering to his feet, his face growing more grey and pinched. "She loved thee once," Clorinda said. "She was a gentle soul and would not forget. She will allow thee mercy." "Birth she went through," he muttered, "and death alone. Birth and death. Daphne, my girl," and his voice trailed off to nothingness, and he lay staring at space and panting. The Duchess sat by him and held his hand. She moved not, though at last he seemed to fall asleep. 2 hours later he began to stir. He turned his head slowly upon his pillows until his gaze rested upon her as she sat fronting him. 'Twas as though he had awakened to look at her. "Clo!" he cried, and though his voice was but a whisper, there was both wonder and wild question in it. "Clo!" But she moved not, her great eyes meeting his with steady gaze, and even as they so looked at each other, his body stretched itself, his lids fell, and he was a dead man. Chapter 24 of A Lady of Quality by Frances Hodgson Burnett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. CHAPTER 24 The dove sat upon the window ledge and lowly cooed and cooed. When they had had 10 years of happiness, Anne died. 'Twas of no violent illness; it seemed but that through these years of joy she had been gradually losing life. She had grown thinner and whiter, and her soft eyes bigger and more prayerful. 'Twas in the summer, and they were at Camylott, when one sweet day she came from the flower garden with her hands full of roses, and sitting down by her sister in the morning room, swooned away, scattering her blossoms on her lap and at her feet. When she came back to consciousness she looked up at the Duchess with a strange, far look, as if her soul had wandered back from some great distance. "Let me be borne to bed, sister," she said. "I would lie still. I shall not get up again." The look in her face was so unearthly and a thing so full of mystery that her Grace's heart stood still, for in some strange way she knew the end had come. They bore her to her tower and laid her in her bed, when she looked once round the room and then at her sister. "'Tis a fair, peaceful room," she said, "and the prayers I have prayed in it have been answered. To day I saw my mother, and she told me so." "Anne, Anne!" cried her Grace, leaning over her and gazing fearfully into her face, for though her words sounded like delirium, her look had no wildness in it, and yet "Anne, Anne, you wander, love," the Duchess cried. Anne smiled a strange sweet smile. "Perchance I do," she said. "I know not, truly, but I am very happy." She said that all was over, and that I had not done wrong. She had a fair young face, with eyes that seemed to have looked always at the stars of heaven. She said I had done no wrong. The Duchess's face laid itself down upon the pillow, a river of clear tears running down her cheeks. "Wrong!" she said. "You, dear one, woman of Christ's heart, if ever lived one. You were so weak and I so strong, and yet as I look back it seems that all of the good that made me worthy to be wife and mother I learned from your simplicity." Through the tower window, the ivy closing round it, the blueness of the summer sky was heavenly fair. Soft and light white clouds floated across the clearness of its sapphire. On this Anne's eyes were fixed with an uplifted tenderness until she broke her silence. "Soon I shall be away," she said. "Soon all will be left behind, and I would tell you that my prayers were answered, and so, sure, yours will be." No man could tell what made the Duchess then fall on her knees, but she knew herself. 'Twas that she saw in the exalted dying face that turned to hers, concealing nothing more. "Anne, Anne!" she cried. "Sister Anne! Mother Anne of my children! You have known all the years and kept it hid." She dropped her queenly head and shielded the whiteness of her face in the coverlid's folds. "Ay, sister," Anne said, coming a little back to earth. "And from the first. I found a letter near the sundial. I guessed. I loved you, and could do naught else but guard you. Many a day have I watched within the rose garden, many a day and night God pardon me and night. When I knew a letter was hid, 'twas my wont to linger near, knowing that my presence would keep others away. And when you approached, or he, I slipped aside and waited beyond the rose hedge, that if I heard a step I might make some sound of warning. Sister, I was your sentinel, and being so, knelt while on my guard, and prayed." "My sentinel!" Clorinda cried. "And knowing all, you so guarded me night and day, and prayed God's pity on my poor madness and girl's frenzy." And she gazed at her in amaze, and with humblest burning tears. "For my own poor self, as well as for you, sister, did I pray God's pity as I knelt," said Anne. "For long I knew it not, being so ignorant, but alas, I loved him too. I loved him too. I have loved no man other all my days. He was unworthy any woman's love, and I was too lowly for him to cast a glance on. But I was a woman, and God made us so." Clorinda clutched her pallid hand. "Dear God!" she cried, "you loved him!" Anne moved upon her pillow, drawing weakly, slowly, near until her white lips were close upon her sister's ear. "The night," she panted, "the night you bore him in your arms." Then did the other woman give a shuddering start and lift her head, staring with a frozen face. "What what?" she cried. "Down this dark stairway," the panting voice went on, "to the far cellar. I kept watch again." "You kept watch you?" the Duchess gasped. "Upon the stair which led to the servants' place, that I might stop them if aught disturbed them, and they opened their doors, that I might send them back, telling them it was I." Then stooped the Duchess nearer to her, her hands clutching the coverlid, her eyes widening. "Anne, Anne," she cried, "you knew the awful thing that I would hide that too? You knew that he was there?" Anne lay upon her pillow, her own eyes gazing out through the ivy hung window of her tower, at the blue sky and the fair, fleecy clouds. A flock of snow white doves were flying back and forth across it, and one sat upon the window's deep ledge and cooed. All was warm and perfumed with summer sweetness. There seemed naught between her and the uplifting blueness, and naught of the earth was near but the dove's deep throated cooing and the laughter of her Grace's children floating upward from the garden of flowers below. "I lie upon the brink," she said, "upon the brink, sister, and methinks my soul is too near to God's pure justice to fear as human things fear, and judge as earth does. She said I did no wrong. Yes, I knew." "And knowing," her sister cried, "you came to me that afternoon." "To stand by that which lay hidden, that I might keep the rest away, being a poor creature and timorous and weak." "Weak! Weak!" the Duchess cried, amid a greater flood of streaming tears. "I have dared to call you so, who have the heart of a great lioness. Oh, sweet Anne, weak!" "'Twas love," Anne whispered. "Your love was strong, and so was mine. That other love was not for me. I knew that my long woman's life would pass without it, for woman's life is long, alas, if love comes not. But you were love's self, and I worshipped you and it, and to myself I said, praying forgiveness on my knees, that one woman should know love if I did not. And being so poor and imperfect a thing, what mattered if I gave my soul for you? And love, which is so great and rules the world. Look at the doves, sister. Look at them, flying past the heavenly blueness. And she said I did no wrong." Her hand was wet with tears fallen upon it, as her Duchess sister knelt and held and kissed it, sobbing. "You knew, poor love, you knew!" she cried. "Ay, all of it I knew," Anne said, "and his torture of you and the madness of your horror. And when he forced himself within the panelled parlour that day of fate, I knew he came to strike some deadly blow. And in such anguish I waited in my chamber for the end, that when it came not, I crept down, praying that somehow I might come between, and I went in the room." "And there what saw you?" quoth the Duchess, shuddering. "Somewhat you must have seen, or you could not have known." "Ay," said Anne, "and heard," and her chest heaved. "Heard!" cried Clorinda. "Great God of mercy!" "The room was empty, and I stood alone. It was so still I was afraid. It seemed so like the silence of the grave. And then there came a sound, a long and shuddering breath, but one, and then " the memory brought itself too keenly back, and she fell a shivering. "I heard a slipping sound, and a dead hand fell on the floor, lying outstretched, its palm turned upwards, showing beneath the valance of the couch." She threw her frail arms around her sister's neck, and as Clorinda clasped her own, breathing gaspingly, they swayed together. "What did you then?" the Duchess cried in a wild whisper. "I prayed God keep me sane, and knelt and looked below. I thrust it back, the dead hand saying aloud, 'Swoon you must not, swoon you must not, swoon you shall not. God help, God help!' And I saw the purple mark, his eyes upturned, his fair curls spread, and I lost strength and fell upon my side, and for a minute lay there, knowing that shudder of breath had been the very last expelling of his being, and his hand had fallen by its own weight. "Oh God! Oh God! Oh God!" Clorinda cried, and over said the word, and over again. "How was't? How was't?" Anne shuddered, clinging to her. "How was't 'twas done? I have so suffered, being weak. I have so prayed. God will have mercy. But it has done me to death, this knowledge, and before I die, I pray you tell me that I may speak truly at God's throne." "Oh God! Oh God! Oh God!" Clorinda groaned. "Oh God!" and having cried so, looking up, was blanched as a thing struck with death, her eyes like a great stag's that stands at bay. "Stay! Stay!" she cried with a sudden shock of horror, for a new thought had come to her which, strangely, she had not had before. "You thought I murdered him?" Convulsive sobs heaved Anne's poor chest, tears sweeping her hollow cheeks, her thin, soft hands clinging piteously to her sister's. "Through all these years I have known nothing," she wept. "Sister, I have known nothing but that I found him hidden there, a dead man, whom you so hated and so feared." Her hands resting upon the bed's edge, Clorinda held her body upright, such passion of wonder, love, and pitying, adoring awe in her large eyes as was a thing like to worship. "You thought I murdered him and loved me still," she said. "You thought I murdered him, and still you shielded me, and gave me chance to live, and to repent, and know love's highest sweetness. You thought I murdered him, and yet your soul had mercy. Now do I believe in God, for only a God could make a heart so noble." "And you did not," cried out Anne, and raised upon her elbow, her breast panting, but her eyes growing wide with light as from stars from heaven. "Oh, sister love, thanks be to Christ who died." The Duchess rose and stood up tall and great, her arms outthrown. "I think 'twas God Himself who did it," she said, "though 'twas I who struck the blow. He drove me mad and blind, he tortured me and thrust to my heart's core. He taunted me with that vile thing nature will not let women bear, and did it in my Gerald's name, calling on him. And then I struck with my whip, knowing nothing, not seeing, only striking, like a goaded, dying thing. He fell and lay there, and all was done." "But not with murderous thought, only through frenzy and a cruel chance a cruel, cruel chance. And of your own will blood is not upon your hand." Anne panted and sank back upon her pillow. "With deepest oaths I swear," Clorinda said, and she spoke through her clenched teeth, "if I had not loved, if Gerald had not been my soul's life and I his, I would have stood upright and laughed in his face at the devil's threats. Should I have feared? You know me. Was there a thing on earth or in heaven or hell I feared until love rent me? 'Twould but have fired my blood and made me mad with fury that dares all. 'Spread it abroad,' I would have cried to him. 'Tell it to all the world, craven and outcast, whose vileness all men know, and see how I shall bear myself, and how I shall drive through the town with head erect. As I bore myself when I set the rose crown on my head, so shall I bear myself then, and you shall see what comes.' This would I have said, and held to it and gloried. But I knew love, and there was an anguish that I could not endure. That my Gerald should look at me with changed eyes, feeling that somewhat of his rightful need was gone. And I was all distraught and conquered. Of ending his base life I never thought, never at my wildest, though I had thought to end my own. But when fate struck the blow for me, then I swore that carrion should not taint my whole life through. It should not, for 'twas Fate's self had doomed me to my ruin. And there it lay until the night. For this I planned, that being of such great strength for a woman, I could bear his body in my arms to the farthest of that labyrinth of cellars I had commanded to be cut off from the rest and closed. And so I did when all were sleeping. But you, poor Anne, but you. And there I laid him, and there he lies to day, an evil thing turned to a handful of dust." "It was not murder," whispered Anne. "No, it was not." She lifted to her sister's gaze a quivering lip. "And yet once I had loved him years I had loved him," she said, whispering still. "And in a woman there is ever somewhat that the mother creature feels." The hand which held her sister's shook as with an ague, and her poor lip quivered. "Sister, I saw him again." The Duchess drew closer as she gasped. "Again?" "I could not rest," the poor voice said. "He had been so base, he was so beautiful and so unworthy love. And he was dead, none knowing, untouched by any hand that even pitied him that he was so base a thing, for that indeed is piteous when death comes, and none can be repentant. And he lay so hard upon the stones." Her teeth were chattering, and with a breath drawn like a wild sob of terror, the Duchess threw her arm about her and drew her nearer. "Sweet Anne!" she shuddered. Sweet Anne, come back, you wander." "Nay, 'tis not wandering," Anne said. "'Tis true, sister. There is no night these years gone by I have not remembered it again and seen. In the night after that you bore him there, I prayed until the mid hours, when all were sleeping fast, and then I stole down, in my bare feet that none could hear me, and at last I found my way in the black dark, feeling the walls, until I reached that farthest door in the stone, and then I lighted my taper and opened it." "Anne," cried the Duchess, "Anne, look through the tower window at the blueness of the sky at the blueness, Anne." But drops of cold water had started out and stood upon her brow. "He lay there in his grave. It was a little black place with its stone walls. His fair locks were tumbled," Anne went on, whispering. "The spot was black upon his brow, and methought he had stopped mocking, and surely looked upon some great and awful thing, which asked of him a question. I knelt and laid his curls straight and his hands, and tried to shut his eyes, but close they would not, but stared at that which questioned. And having loved him so, I kissed his poor cheeks as his mother might have done, that he might not stand outside, having carried not one tender human thought with him. And, oh, I prayed, sister, I prayed for his poor soul with all my own. If there is one noble or gentle thing he has ever done through all his life, I prayed, Jesus, remember it. Christ, do not forget. We who are human do so few things that are noble. Oh, surely one must count." The Duchess's head lay near her sister's breast, and she had fallen a sobbing, and weeping like a young broken child. "Oh, brave and noble, pitiful, strong, fair soul!" she cried. "As Christ loved you have loved, and He would hear your praying. Since you so pleaded, He would find one thing to hang His mercy on." She lifted her fair, tear streaming face, clasping her hands as one praying. "And I," she cried, "have I not built a temple on his grave? Have I not tried to live a fair life, and be as Christ bade me? Have I not loved, and pitied and succoured those in pain? Have I not filled a great man's days with bliss and love and wifely worship? Have I not given him noble children, bred in high lovingness, and taught to love all things God made, even the very beasts that perish, since they too suffer as all do? Have I left aught undone? Oh, sister, I have so prayed that I have left naught, even though I could not believe that there was One who, ruling all, could yet be pitiless as He is to some. I have prayed that, which sure it seems must be, though we comprehend it not, to teach me faith in something greater than my poor self and not of earth. Say this to Christ's self when you are face to face. Say this to Him, I pray you. Anne, Anne, look not so strangely through the window at the blueness of the sky, sweet soul, but look at me." For Anne lay upon her pillow, so smiling that 'twas a strange thing to behold. It seemed as she were smiling at the whiteness of the doves against the blue. A moment her sister stood up watching her, and then stirred, meaning to go to call one of the servants waiting outside. But though she moved not her gaze from the tower window, Mistress Anne faintly spoke. "Nay, stay," she breathed. "I go softly, Stay." Clorinda fell upon her knees again and bent her lips close to her ear. This was death, and yet she feared it not. This was the passing of a soul, and while it went it seemed so fair and loving a thing that she could ask it her last question, her greatest, knowing it was so near to God that its answer must be rest. "Anne, Anne," she whispered, "must he know, my Gerald? Must I tell him all? If so I must, I will, upon my knees." The doves came flying downward from the blue and lighted on the window stone and cooed. Anne's answer was as low as her soft breath, and her still eyes were filled with joy at that she saw, but which another could not. "Nay," she breathed, "tell him not. What need? Wait, and let God tell him, who understands." Then did her soft breath stop, and she lay still, her eyes yet open, and smiling at the blossoms and the doves who sat upon the window ledge and lowly cooed and cooed. 'Twas her Duchess sister who clad her for her last sleeping, and made her chamber fair. The hand of no other touched her, and while 'twas done the tower chamber was full of the golden sunshine, and the doves ceased not to flutter about the window and coo as if they spoke lovingly to each other of what lay within the room. The children came to look, their arms full of blossoms and flowering sprays. They had been told only fair things of death, and knowing but these fair things, thought of it but as the opening of a golden door. They entered softly, as entering the chamber of a queen, and moving tenderly, with low and gentle speech, spread all their flowers about the bed, laying them round her head, on her breast, and in her hands, and strewing them thick everywhere. "She lies in a bower and smiles at us," one said. "She hath grown beautiful like you, mother, and her face seems like a white star in the morning." "She loves us as she ever did," the fair child Daphne said. "She will never cease to love us, and will be our angel. Now we have an angel of our own." When the Duke returned, who had been absent since the day before, the Duchess led him to the Tower chamber, and they stood together hand in hand and gazed at her peace. "Gerald," the Duchess said in her tender voice, "she smiles, does not she?" "Yes," was Osmonde's answer. "Yes, love, as if at God, who has smiled at herself. Faithful, tender woman heart." The hand which he held in his clasp clung closer, the other crept to his shoulder and lay there trembling. "How faithful and how tender, my Gerald," Clorinda said, "I only know. She is my saint, sweet Anne, whom I dared to treat so lightly in my poor wayward days. Gerald, she knows all my sins, and to day she has carried them in her pure hands to God and asked His mercy on them. She had none of her own." "And so having done, dear heart, she lies amid her flowers and smiles," he said, and he drew her white hand to press it against his breast. While her body slept beneath soft turf and flowers, and that which was herself was given in God's heaven, all joys for which her earthly being had yearned, even when unknowing how to name its longing, each year that passed made more complete and splendid the lives of those she had so loved. Never, 'twas said, had woman done such deeds of gentleness and shown so sweet and generous a wisdom as the great Duchess. None who were weak were in danger if she used her strength to aid them. No man or woman was a lost thing whom she tried to save. Such tasks she set herself as no lady had ever given herself before, but 'twas not her way to fail, her will being so powerful, her brain so clear, her heart so purely noble. Pauper and prince, noble and hind, honoured her and her lord alike, and all felt wonder at their happiness. It seemed that they had learned life's meaning and the honouring of love, and this they taught to their children, to the enriching of a long and noble line. In the ripeness of years they passed from earth in as beauteous peace as the sun sets, and upon a tablet above the resting place of their ancestors there are inscribed lines like these: "Here sleeps by her husband the purest and noblest lady God e'er loved. Yet the high and gentle deeds of her chaste sweet life sleep not, but live and grow, and so will do so long as earth is earth." End of A Lady of Quality by Frances Hodgson Burnett. Recorded by Linda Andrus, Waukesha, Wisconsin. 2012.